Hey everybody, I have another log, so let's make some interactive art. We'll start this project with a trip to my dad's workshop to use this bandsaw. The idea is to remove an inch or so thick disc off the top and bottom of the log, and then we're going to try and cut out the core and leave a wall. That will give us an open front kind of stage to showcase the sculpture. Now that was the plan, and of course, as you know what they say, the best laid plans of mice and men oft go awry. Well, at least Robert Burns said that. But the blade that we had was too wide and not aggressive enough to make the sharp curve that we needed. My dad was nice enough to order a new one, but they sent the wrong size blade, so time to go to plan B. That means cutting across the log and then along the edge. So instead of one core, we're going to get a few pieces of various sizes and thicknesses. But as is often the case, this is a good thing. It's going to take the piece in a new and probably more interesting direction. This method did leave the inside of that wall pretty cut up and uneven, so let's take care of that now. Back at my studio, we're going to start cutting off these super high spots inside the log. And by the way, if you do something like this, please wear a respirator, safety goggles, and air protection. I forgot for just a couple of minutes, and I've had a cough for over a week and a half. Also, while doing this, I discovered that we'll have to take the bark off after all. I know I didn't mention that, but my original plan was to glue the bark back on, but I can't find some of the big pieces. Either way, I'll spare you watching me removing all the bark and getting worm goop on my hands. I also learned that the only thing holding the top cookie together was the bark, so we're going to glue that together, and an adjustable bungee strap will clamp all these pieces together while it dries. The bottom disc also cracked and opened up, so we're going to use a ratchet strap to squeeze it back into shape while the glue dries. And while those dry, I want to open the front wall another inch or two, so we're just going to mark off where to cut and start cutting. I thought I recorded it, but I didn't, so you'll just have to imagine me filling all the cuts inside the log with a mix of wood glue and sawdust. We're going to paint this later on, so color matching the wood isn't as important as getting a smooth surface. But with that magically all dry, we can start sanding down the inside of the log. Now, I started with a 60 grit to get the big stuff, but then I went through a handful of sanding spindles on my rotary tool to smooth it all out. With the log parts cleaned, let's move on to the sculpture. My idea is an abstract, organic tree that the viewer can rotate inside the log. For the trunk, we'll use the largest chunk of wood from the core, then grab out the oscillating multi-tool and start sculpting the tree. My idea is that the tree trunk will hold a kind of abstract globe of leaves. So we'll be carving what at first will look like a Lego people hand. But because of the funky cuts on this block, we're going to have to adapt the final shape. But we'll get to that in a minute. Right now, it's going to be a lot of cutting small sections and something I don't do well at all, which is just being patient. I tried using my least favorite tool, the jigsaw, to cut that inner curve, but I ended up just bending two blades. Being from the core of the log, the wood is still pretty wet, so the blade is binding a lot. And as the blade hung up, the jigsaw just bent it. So I went back to cutting out blocks and being patient-ish. Although it's not my lack of patience, it's going to come back to haunt me in a minute. I ended up cutting too deeply into a thin section just behind the trunk. And at this point, I'm just hoping that it holds together while I refine the shape so I can fill it later. As I started to refine the shape, it eventually did snap. Though instead of trying to glue it back together now, we're going to finish refining the shape a little bit more. This break is disappointing, but it's just part of the process. For me, art is an exploration and an experiment. Now, don't get me wrong, I do refine my technique, but I'm constantly pushing and experimenting. I'll often do something wrong just to see what happens. So something like this break is just bound to happen just because of the way I work. Before we can keep refining the trunk, we need to glue these halves back together. So we're going to add some pins made of a bamboo skewer. Now those pins will hold the parts together and key them so they don't start sliding around. To line up where to drill the holes on both halves, I painted around the first set I drilled so the impression would transfer. This isn't the best way to do this, and I'll show you another way later, but let's glue the halves together and temporarily add some staples to act as a clamp. And while that's healing up, let's attach the log's base back to the wall. One thing I wasn't expecting is that the wall shrank faster than the top and bottom, which makes sense because it is thinner. And as I attach the wall and base, I want to preserve the surface texture, but I don't see a way of doing that and getting these parts to look seamlessly lined up. I mean, for example, I could sand it all smooth, but that doesn't fit with my original vision. But we can get them pretty close together by pegging the wall to the bottom disc with some scrap dowel rod. So we'll start by adding a couple of holes to one side. As I mentioned before, there are a few tricks to lining up the holes between two pieces. We're going to use the upside down tape method. Now, it's not extremely accurate, but it does get the job done. All you have to do is drill your first set of holes, and then you cover them with painter's tape sticky side out. You'll hold that tape in place by either rolling the ends down or using small pieces of tape to hold it in place. Then punch through the tape where your holes are, and when you sandwich the pieces back together, stick the tape to the second piece. Now mark your drill holes, pull off the tape, and drill the holes. We'll do the same thing on the other side, but with more loose fitting holes to allow for stretching the wall. And then some wood glue will hold this all together. To stretch the wall back in shape, I'm jerry-rigging 2 bar clamps. We'll stuff one inside the wall, so as we tighten the handle, we're effectively opening the clamp wider and pushing the wall open. The second clamp is there to hold the first one down, otherwise it wants to slowly pop out. And the wood glue will hold all of this together. Remember, a good wood glue is stronger than the wood itself. With that space assembled, we can craft the tree to fit. I was lucky enough to have a couple of thin pieces of offcuts that we can use to cut into some abstract curved shapes. Now, I won't show making all of them, but the idea is to let the wood tell you what it wants to be. To do that, we're going to pick 2 points on the trunk and work to make a shape that ends up meeting both points, if you can. Here, let me explain. Sometimes the pieces will break in unexpected ways as you're cutting, and you simply have to adjust from there. And sometimes it goes exactly as you want, but it looks wrong in place, and then you have to refine the shape. And then sometimes it looks great in place, but it's just too big to fit in the log, and you have to cut it down. But the end result will be an organic, abstract shape that just kind of feels right to you. And with all our pieces in place, we'll let that dry, and then we're going to add an axle to the bottom of the trunk. To do that, we're going to find the approximate center of the trunk and drill a hole a little larger than the dowel rod. Then, before adding the dowel rod, we're going to find the center of the stage floor by rotating the tree, making sure we have clearance on all sides. We can then use the upside down tape trick to mark the hole for mounting the tree. But back at the tree, we're going to glue the dowel rod in with a mix of wood glue and sawdust. Before we glue on the top, let's paint. Now, originally I was going to paint dark earth tones and a black background, kind of a night forest scene. But I've been in a dark mood myself lately, so I need some brightness. I'm going to try a technique where I drop colorful paint onto the wood and let it sit for a few minutes. To fill the spaces in between those drops, we're just going to spread the paint around. Now, if you do like what you see here, feel free to stop. But I wasn't happy with it, so I scraped off all of that paint and left this colorful floor with swirls of dark brown, purple, kind of between and around them. Then I'll use this same dark purple to make a wash for the walls. Eventually, I'll actually use the same wash to even out the color of the top. But before we get to the top, let's paint the tree. I started trying washes, but this is maple and it can be splotchy with washes and stains. So after finding out that my woodworker friend was right after all, I switched to straight acrylic. So the trunk is a mix of light and medium browns, and I brushed off areas to fade them to be a little more translucent. Then for the branches, I brushed in large streaks and swirls of darker and lighter green to have more contrast between the two tones. Once that's dry, we can mount it with a small screw. This screw has a long unthreaded area that should allow the tree to spin freely while the threads hold the axle. If that doesn't work long term, I'll figure out something that's a little more robust, but so far so good. My method is to try the simplest solution first and go more complex from there. But with the tree mounted, we'll cover it with some scrap plastic and add the top. Now, I'm not usually one who goes in for what I consider kitsch. That's stuff like lights or other things that won't last. But with this piece I can't help myself, it just needs lights. So I just stapled on some LED string lights, and if I want to remove them later, I don't think it will be all that difficult. Now we can attach the top with pegs and glue like we did for the bottom. This time though, we don't need to stretch the walls. And again, as I mentioned way earlier, you're going to see that I'm not trying to get all these pieces perfectly aligned, but they do look like the rustic stage I have in mind. And with that all done, I'll show you the final piece. Well, I hope you found some inspiration for your own art, and if you don't have access to a log, consider other materials like basswood, cardboard, or even metal. And if you did enjoy this video and would like more ideas, hit like and subscribe. I would love to have you as part of the growing on-hand art community. And if you did like this video, I'll leave a link to one that YouTube thinks you'll like too. But thanks for watching, and remember, your art is enough and you are creative.